I used to be a sheriff in a small town called Reverie in the Midwest. It was a pretty good gig. There wasn't a lot of action most of the time. A couple of neighborhood kids were vandals and I had to give out a few fines. One of them shoplifted something from the general store once, I think. I also had to give it a few speeding tickets, but that wasn't to locals, so it was one of the easiest parts of the job. A couple times I also drove home a couple of drunk folks from the bar, telling them they'd have to come back to get their car in the morning. But beyond that, I never had to deal with much actual hardcore crime. That was, at least, until April 22nd of 2017. My partner Blake and I were sitting in the office, shooting the breeze. The sun was low in the sky and was painting it a dull red. I heard a car door close and some scrambled shuffling of footsteps on the concrete up to the door. I preemptively halted our conversation and looked to the door to see what was going on. It was Janet Wilson with Miriam, their 12-year-old daughter. I knew the Wilson family pretty well. Mark Wilson, Janet's husband, was my mechanic, and I had only had pleasant interactions with their family previously. But on April 22nd, 2017, both Janet and Miriam were crying and deep in hysterics as they entered the station. Blake and I wasted no time rising to our feet to address the situation. It's difficult at times not to mirror what you see in the people before you, but I remained calm and approached them, asking what was wrong and what was happening. Miriam was trying to talk, but it was impossible to tell what she was saying through her blubbering. "Someone ate Benji," Janet managed to get out. "What?" I racked my brain trying to remember who Benji was. They had a 15-year-old who used to play with my kid. What was his name? It was John. Had they had a new baby then? "Who's Benji?" I asked. "Our dog," she cried. 12-year-old Miriam was holding up her phone to show a video to Blake, and he took the device from her, peering at it like he was struggling to make sense of it. Meanwhile, I addressed Janet. "Where are Mark and John? It's Saturday. The shop isn't open, is it?" "They went after her into the forest," Janet explained. "Who is her?" I asked, just as Blake was handing me the phone. He had a rather disturbed look in his eyes. "You check that out. Janet, come with me. I need to take a statement," Blake said, guiding Janet into the interview room. Miriam stayed with me to show me how to use the device. I wasn't very technology savvy at the time. She put the video back to the beginning and played it. There was a lot of screaming and camera shaking right from the jump, but I could make out what was happening. It appeared to have been filmed through the screen of the Wilsons' back door. About midway into their yard, it showed a large, doughy creature wrapped in a tattered black shawl. I squinted, as Blake had to see if it was a bear, but it appeared to have a human face, albeit deformed, with an elongated jaw and mouth and a few strands of long gray hair. It looked to be a morbidly obese elderly woman, no one that I recognized from the town, and she was crawling on all fours like an animal, using her mouth to interact with things, including the Wilsons' golden retriever, which it was holding in its jaws. The dog was limp and appeared to be dead. Its fur looked bloodied, but then again it was hard to tell what was happening in the video. "How old is Benji?" I asked Miriam. 6, she cried out. That was alarming. This was a fully grown dog, but it looked like a puppy. This creature, this old woman, whatever it was, it must have been massive. Maybe 7 feet tall. There was yelling in the video as Mark and John came running into the foreground with guns and shot at the creature. It took the golden retriever in its mouth and ran on all fours into the woods. I felt disgusted and disturbed. The video cut off. "So the last time you saw them they were running into the woods?" I asked Miriam. "Yeah," she replied. "All right, we better go over there." We took my cruiser over to the Wilsons' house with sirens blaring. I really had no idea what we were up against, but I at least had the basic instinct to tell Miriam to wait at the house. She screamed at me that she didn't want to, and that she would be alone there, and I empathized but told her that we didn't know if it was safe, and that she must. She finally obeyed as I promised her that I would find her brother, father, and dog and bring them back safely, and I made my way alone into the woods with my hand on my gun. I could see all 3 sets of footsteps in the mud, 2 pairs of large shoes, and the oddly long and abstract foot and handprints of the creature. The bone structure of each hand and foot looked like it had been drawn into the mud by Picasso. Whatever this thing had been originally, I felt quite sure it had mutated far beyond it. I had limited tracking experience, but luckily, as the ground became drier and the footprints began harder to follow, I started to hear a faint yelling in the distance. Following the sound of the yelling, I was led to Mark Wilson, who was visibly distraught, pacing back and forth in some shallow growth and breathing heavily. "Mark, what's going on? Where's John?" I asked him. "I don't know. I've lost him." "How did that happen?" I asked him. He looked like he was about to cry, and I realized I needed to pull back. "This thing, it ate Benji, and we ran after it." "I know about the thing, Mark. How did you separate from John?" "Well, we lost sight of it, right? And John was pretty sure it went straight, and I thought that it went right. So I went off to the right, John continued straight, and then I came back when I realized I was wrong. I tried to meet up with him in the middle, but I couldn't find him. I don't know what to do." "John!" he continued calling out. "Okay, Mark, here's what we're going to do. You checked right. You're 100% certain he's not to the right, is that correct?" Yes, he's not to the right," Mark replied. "Okay, Mark, you're going to continue going straight. I'm going to backtrack a bit, and then I'm going to check the left side in case the monster veered off in that direction. If it had gone straight and he found it, we wouldn't know, right?" "Right, yeah, that makes sense," Mark agreed. "All right, let's do this then. One more thing, Mark. Was John armed?" Yes, he had the rifle," Mark explained, still frazzled. "All right, good to know. Don't want to get shot. He's probably okay, all right? We're going to find him. Don't worry." "Okay." Mark sounded a little more confident now that we had a plan, and we went off in our separate ways. I knew I shouldn't have gone off on my own like this. It was against protocol, and in hindsight it was incredibly stupid. Blake should have come with me, and we should have taken Janet's statement later. But in the heat of the moment, these things don't always come to fruition, and with the light fast dying in the sky, I knew that our best window of opportunity was closing rapidly. I didn't really have to walk far before I came upon a man-made structure. I racked my brain and realized it was the fence of the tri-municipality graveyard. Rather than a graveyard in each township, Brant, Holstein, and Reverie all shared one. It was closest to us here in Reverie, though. The fence around it was a standard plastic-coated chain-link fence, and even in the twilight I could tell that there was a massive hole ripped in it, and in other places it looked like it had been bowled over. I couldn't see the far side of the graveyard, though. It was exceptionally large, and there were forests throughout it. I drew my pistol and passed through the hole in the fence into the yard. I immediately noticed that many of the graves had been dug up, not professionally, not a neat, tidy hole, dug up like an animal, a concave hole in the dirt next to a convex pile. But not only had the graves been dug, their contents, the remains of people, were scattered about the place, in various stages of not only decay, but consumption. Massive bites had been taken out of many of them. Even bones had been broken off. I examined a piece of what I believed to be a femur, and inside, the marrow had been sucked right out. My heart was pounding, and my adrenaline was flowing as I proceeded deeper into the graveyard. I could hear sloppy, slobbery eating noises, but I couldn't tell what direction they were coming from. They just seemed to ring in the twilight. Finally, I noticed something. It was the body, not of a human, but of a golden retriever, so it stood out. I knew this must have been Benji, but he was in a more advanced state of consumption than when I had seen him in the video. His body was lying 1 meter away from another massive hole dug into the earth. The sloppy eating noises appeared to be emanating from it, and I feared the worst. If this creature was no longer eating the dog, what was he eating? For once in my life, I prayed that it was a grave being desecrated. I walked up to the edge of the giant pit carefully so as not to make any noise and peered inside. It was hard to see details in the darkened twilight, but I could tell this was the creature from the video. It was a great monstrosity, packed snugly into the hole, with dirt walls around it. Its flesh appeared pale, even in the barely lit sky, and it was wearing the same tattered black shawl. It was vocalizing with feminine grunts as it ate as well. I don't know why my brain decided to try to arrest it. It was barely a human. Maybe a part of me hoped something was salvageable in her and that I was doing the right thing. I panicked and screamed at it to show me its hands and stop whatever it was doing. It looked up at me, revealing John underneath it. There was a gaping hole in his abdomen. The look on his face was of pure shock and horror, but I could tell that the light in his eyes had died. The creature grinned at me as it released a feminine whine into the air. Its mouth was dripping with blood and undigested food from John's intestines, and the air was ripe with this essence as well. Looking more closely at the creature's face in that brief moment, it did in fact appear to be an old woman, despite her being the size of a professional strongman. She had gray hair and eyes that looked in slightly different directions. Her face was covered in boils, and there were clearly deformities in her facial bone structure as well as in her feet and hands. Her lips and eyelids appeared bloated. She was missing multiple teeth, but had other large teeth to make up for it. Teeth that were separated at the root, but looked like they had been fused together to form a sheer plate. I thought that finding John there would be the last thing I wanted to see, but what I hadn't anticipated is that she would smile at me. That was the last thing I wanted to see. She began giggling almost excitedly as she lumbered up the dirt mound towards me, throwing an arm or two at my feet to try to sweep my legs and pull me into the grave with her. Luckily, I jumped out of the way just in time and fired a couple rounds in her direction. She slipped back down to the bottom of the pit, but her excitement and giggling only increased. I retreated a few meters, wanting to give myself a safer distance. She then jumped, seemingly effortlessly, to the top of the mound. I was alarmed. Her size shouldn't have allowed that. I wasn't sure if my first 2 rounds landed, but I fired another carefully now. It hit her in the shoulder, but she almost seemed to enjoy it. She was panting like a dog and came over to me lumbering excitedly. I fired a 4th round and watched it slide into her cheek, but that direct shot to the face she didn't seem to notice at all. I wasn't looking where I was going as I backed up, and I tripped over a corpse and fell onto my back. I panicked and fired the last 2 rounds as she came hobbling over to me and excitedly sank her 2 massive teeth into my inner right thigh. I screamed in both pain and terror as its powerful jaws began gnawing away at my flesh. I could feel her enormous, diseased tongue moving through the wound as she bit down again in another ravenous bite. A shotgun blast went off right beside me. I hadn't even noticed Mark approaching. The power of the shot was enough to cause the hag to fall back away from me, but taking a chunk of my leg with her as she went. I screamed again as Mark approached the beast to finish it off. The second blast of the shotgun, directly to the creature's neck, did the trick as its head came clean off. I did my best to come to my senses and told Mark where his son could be found as I made a call for backup on my radio. I watched the decapitated head of the grave hag still moving around, eyes still not aligned, still making concentric circles in random directions. Her tongue flicked in the air and her jaw bit down upon it. I got to the hospital, but weeks later it was found that I had an antibiotic-resistant infection in my leg and a lot of tissue had to be amputated. It took me about a year to be able to walk again. The grave hag was given an autopsy, and it was found that her entire body was a cornucopia of ulcers and cancerous growths and scar tissues. She could not be identified in any of the 3 towns surrounding the graveyard, and no one was sure where she came from. We put out a statewide notice, but never heard anything back. Blake was deeply apologetic that he hadn't been there for me, but I told him no one could have predicted that. No one could have predicted what happened. The Wilson family had a considerable amount of grieving to do, and my heart goes out to them more than anything. I don't know the circumstances by which the creature spawned, or if it was at one point a person, and what happened to them to get them to that state, but I couldn't stomach going back to the Force. I thought I had been living the quiet life, but even that turned out to be way too much for me. Sometimes I still wake up in the night with nightmares about the grave hag, and vomit as I picture her dirty mouth gnawing away at my legs. Thanks for listening, guys. Subscribe and hit the bell for more original horror stories on Thursdays, and tune in at Sunday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Nightmare Theater, an open book club for nightmares. Until next time, embrace the beautiful dark.